Good morning, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for attending this memorial for Professor Will Harrison. More than a memorial, we've gathered family, friends, colleagues, and former students for a celebration of life, to highlight a life well lived in an outstanding scientific career. Friends and colleagues will share their remembrances of working with Will and highlight his contributions to Alaska, the University of Alaska, the Geophysical Institute, and to cryospheric science. We'll hear stories of a world-class nuclear physicist who became a glaciologist, someone who loved Alaska, the Arctic, the Antarctic, and who made significant contributions to science. Speaking for the Institute, in 2017, we acknowledged Will's outstanding contributions to the GI by awarding him the Roger Smith Lifetime Achievement Award, our highest honor. Let's spend a couple hours remembering and honoring Will, and let's celebrate his life and career. If you haven't signed up to speak, don't worry, there will be some time at the end for additional sharing. Please make use of the chat to make comments. Thanks again, and I'll hand the mic over to Carl Benson.
Hello, am I on the deck? Okay.
Carl, do you want to
I'm going to give a brief summary. Will was born in October 1936 in St. John, New Brunswick, Canada, where he and his two brothers, Evans and Dick, spent lots of time on the waters of Bay of Fundy. He received his bachelor's from Mount Allison University near home in New Brunswick in 1958 and went to London for a special degree in physics in 1960. Then he earned his PhD in nuclear physics at Caltech in 1966. During the next year, while doing nuclear physics at University of Minnesota, he mixed with glacial geologists, including the famed Herb Wright. He joined an expedition to the summit of Mount Logan in 1967 to celebrate the Dominion of Canada's centennial. Will wrote an excellent account of this in the American Alpine Journal. His interest in nuclear physics was faded a bit when he joined Caltech's Blue Glacier project on Mount Olympus and designed and built a camera to take pictures through a borehole as the glacier moved over identifiable objects, pebbles and boulders and whatever. From Caltech, he went to the University of Washington to continue working with his friend and colleague, Charlie Raymond, until he left to join the Geophysical Institute at the University of Alaska in 1972. He remained here, I should say, until he retired as professor emeritus in 1998. Well, one of his first projects at the Geophysical Institute was research on the variegated glacier of Alaska, which Charlie Raymond, University of Washington, Berkeley CAM from Caltech, it was a classic piece of work. They based it on past history, they predicted, and then carefully measured a major surge as it progressed. And this really wrote the book on surging glaciers. Will was exceptionally clever at building new ways of looking at things. He developed and refined tools as research developed, such as the glacier borehole that I mentioned. He built time-lapse motion cameras that he mounted in weatherproof containers, mounted on the sides of a glacier to observe the changes in balance and movement. And these weatherproof containers worked just fine, except that Will had a delightful way of summarizing all the ways cameras can fail, and he including brown bear abuse. He did lots of deep hot water drilling through Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets too, and he just had a clever way of doing things. I remember him telling me once he had a piece that wasn't working right, so he just put some power through it and watched for the smoke to curl out of one of the junctions. He said, "That's it," then he fixed it. Well, he stressed the importance of surging glaciers in planning hydroelectric projects. And when the Susitna Dam was first being considered, Will saw the clear need to educate American engineers and planners. that just had no experience working in country where glaciers are part of the system. So he worked to solve this. He established an international workshop that brought experts from countries who knew about glaciers and had worked with hydroelectric projects dealing with them. Well, one of the main fascinations that Will had was with the Black Rapids Glacier. He pondered why it surged and whether in a warming climate it would ever surge again. He documented the role of subglacier water in lifting and accelerating glacier sliding, and this in turn led to investigating the deformable till underneath. That's the muck and rocks at the base of the glacier. Well, this got to be quite a project. It turned into the PhD dissertation for Martin Trufer, who spoke before and will speak again. Will was a fellow of the American Geophysical Union, and he served the international community by serving as editor of the Journal of Glaciology with Matthew Sturm for 10 years. He participated in the glacier research and teaching program as an emeritus professor until his final illness. He was a patient and skilled mentor for students, and students always appreciated his presence in seminars. Will and his wife Anne have provided the comforts of home and good counsel to many students and faculty over the years. My wife Ruth and I enjoyed their wonderful hospitality in New Brunswick at the cabin, and their cabin on the St. John River, and enjoyed travel with them up the coast of Labrador. We miss him very much. I'll turn this on to Martin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carl. Carl's actually the person who recruited Will to UAF, or as Will like to say, Carl's the person who recruited Anne to Fairbanks, and then Will along with her to UAF. So thanks for this summary of Will's life, particularly in the sciences. When I was thinking about what I should say today, I thought I'll just focus on a few things that made Will so special in my mind. I first moved to Fairbanks in 1995 to start my PhD. Will was my PhD advisor, so I was working with him and Keith. And one of the things that in retrospect is interesting to me is that when I came, I really had no idea how much work Will had already done in this field. I knew about his work, of course, in glacier surges and also the work in Greenland, and that's basically what brought me here. But Will was never one that really touted his work, and it was years later, and in some instances, only just recently, that I became aware of some of the work he'd done in some other fields that was really quite prominent, such as on subsea permafrost, for example. So it's quite interesting how you can spend 20, 30 years with somebody for a while, almost daily contact, and really not realize all the stuff he has done. And this is not because he didn't love talking about science. Quite the contrary. He was often quite proud about insights he'd gained and would be very happy to discuss them with you. But again, he was not one to sort of promote himself very much. And even after retirement, I would say he made some really fundamental contributions in glaciology, just with his ability to think a little bit deeper than most other people. He wrote some papers very late on a very fundamental relationship between glaciers and climate that I would have thought had been long figured out, but he managed to put a new spin on it just by going a little bit deeper again. I feel really privileged to have known Will both as a mentor and then as a colleague, but in fact, I'm actually now in the position he was in when I came. I successfully applied to that position when he retired. The interesting thing, though, is that it never felt like much of a transition. He was somebody who would take someone serious Even when I was a beginning graduate student, I felt like we had discussions that were essentially on an equal level, which is of course somewhat ridiculous given the amount of experience he had and I didn't. But he was very good about that, about taking people serious and just concentrating on the science. He wasn't one who was much about titles anyway. He used to really poke fun at the Herr Doctor Professor of sort of the European, maybe kind of authority structure, and that caused him a lot of delight, I think, to poke fun at that. It always struck me as a little funny that he, as a proud descendant of Canadian loyalists, would at the same time have these sort of anarchist tendencies. But there we go. One other thing that made Will really interesting to me is he was just a great guy to have a conversation with, because it was not all, you could kind of switch from the geeky glacier stuff and physics right into other subjects. He was keen to talk about history, which I always had fun talking to him about. He, especially when it pertained to sailing, which is something I knew nothing about. And he also really liked languages, particularly he had a particular delight in educating me in sort of the finer points of the English language, some of which I will not repeat on a recorded Zoom meeting here. He also was fascinated by German, I think, so he would every once in a while he would just drop in and try to impress with another classical quote somewhere out of Goethe or God knows what, and ask me about, you know, some special meaning of a particular obscure German phrase. I am already really missing those kinds of conversations. They were always really entertaining. I don't want to take up the whole day here talking to you. I want to let other people talk, but I would be amiss if I wouldn't just mention how much Will and Anne mean to both my and my wife Dana's life. Their house was always open to us. They became like family very rapidly. Will and Anne both came to our wedding in the Czech Republic. Will was able to visit me at my parents' home in Switzerland, and they have always been like grandparents to our kids. And that's something I will always be thankful for. So I'll stop here, but it gives me a great pleasure to introduce the next speaker on the list, who is Charlie Raymond. I have to say, it brought tears to my eyes when I saw the response on the Google forum where Charlie said, "Will Harrison has been my friend and colleague since 1968. That's the year I was born." I'm so glad, Charlie, that you could make it today, and I'll pass it on to you.
Okay, this is Dick Fiddler. I live in Seattle. I'm blocked from starting the video if anybody would like to let me do. Okay, here we go. Thank you. Good. Well, I met Will in 1958. We were in London. We were students, just arrived in London. We were living in the same dormitory. And just right away, we struck up a friendship. It was a really formative time of life for both of us, I think. We were 21, 22 years old. We were just getting started in the world, first big adventure abroad. And our friendship and life just sort of proceeded from that basis right from the beginning. We just had a lot of good adventures together. I was with Will. I don't want to analyze Will a lot, but he did always strike me as coming from Victorian roots, whatever that means. And he had a bit of the Victorian himself, which I think he couldn't sustain for very long because of his sense of humor. I was with Will when, according to Will, he had his first drink at a bar called the Wheat Sheaf, a pub called the Wheat Sheaf in London, a place that I later learned Dylan Thomas, the poet, had spent most of World War II drinking in. Our big adventure while we were there was Will and I and two other people on four motor scooters, four young men on motor scooters, camping around Europe for the entire summer of 1959. Amazing adventure, discovering the world, meeting people in campgrounds, playing music. It was it was a fabulous way to start a friendship. And I was thinking about that trip, you know, four young men on motor scooters, what could possibly go wrong? Nothing went wrong. The whole summer, I don't think we even ever had an argument the whole summer. It was just this wonderful, genial trip of exploration. After we came back to North America, we just kept on seeing each other whenever we could, whenever we passed through town, whenever it was possible. I spent a Christmas in New Brunswick at Will's parents' house with Will when I was at Harvard. Later on, Will went to Caltech, where I had been an undergraduate, and so we had a lot of chances after that to share Richard Feynman stories. He knew more than I did, but we had some good ones. Spent a beautiful week in the High Sierra with Will and Jim Bardeen and a bunch of friends. I remember in particular a trip out to Third Beach La Push off on the coast of Washington State, out in Olympic National Park. If you watch the slideshow, it's Third Beach La Push is where Will had the religious experience of carrying the giant cross down the beach. As we started that hike, we were hiking through the forest and getting caught up. We met out there and we're just catching up on things. And in the process, Will told me an extremely elegant limerick about Professor Murray Gell-Mann of Caltech. The first line was, "There once was a physicist named Murray. If anybody really needs to know the rest of it, write me and I'll let you know." Quite elegant, quite rude. Continued hiking on, continued telling stories, came around another couple corners on the trail, overtook two guys who were walking out to the beach carrying a pole. They had all their goods in a blanket that was tied to the center of a pole, and they were walking in file carrying the pole along. And as we passed them, Will, without skipping a beat, said, "Oh, hello, Professor Gell-Mann." It was Murray Gell-Mann. Fortunately, the story hadn't been told on the corner before on that trail. I visited Will up on the Blue Glacier, very generous to show me around up there when he was drilling boreholes. I had an amazing time with Will and his son Tom and a cousin on the Variegated Glacier. Flew in, and that was one of the most amazing experiences of my life. Skiing out of the Variegated Glacier, marvelous thing to do. Will was very generous about things. He was happy to give me a rope because I didn't like the looks of wading across the outwash stream at all. Didn't argue with me, just tossed me the rope. With Dan and my family, we all went up to the Kennecott mine, looked at the glacier up there. Great adventure. We just kept keeping in touch all the way along. The last time I saw Will was in January of 2017. He came to town for a mutual friend's memorial, Angie Lavinia. And my last memory of being with him is that we all went on the Women's March together, and Will looked absolutely great wearing a pink pussy hat, I have to say. But he always looked great anyway. A wonderful man, a wonderful friend. Whenever we get together, we just pick up a conversation as though we hadn't been apart at all. It's a real privilege to have known him, and I'm very happy to be meeting so many of his friends now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dick. And I think we found Charlie, so I'll pass it on to Charlie Raymond.
Yes, well, thank you, Martin and Carl, for bringing us together, and sorry for my messed up Zoom. I'm happy to be in the Zoom room, very happy. I first met Will in 1968 when I was a grad student at Caltech. After college on his home ground in New Brunswick and a special program in physics at the University of London, Will entered graduate school in nuclear physics at Caltech, receiving his PhD in 1966. He moved on to the University of Minnesota, but was soon enticed back to Caltech and geophysics by Barclay Cam. Will and I shared an office there, and from then on, we were close friends and colleagues. In summer '68, Barclay sent Will off with me to Athabasca Glacier to help on the last season of my graduate studies fieldwork. Just before we left, a now famous coin toss brought Will into a lasting marriage with Ann Schloss. Ann, unable to depart right away, came to join us on the glacier a few weeks later. Unknown to us, she had arrived at the toe of the glacier and started up toward our camp rather late in the day. Early the next morning, she arrived in good spirits, having been benighted on the ice with no shelter. I got to appreciate that Ann is one tough woman, often affirmed by Will. In 1970 and 71, Will and Ann lived in Seattle. Will was visiting faculty at the UW, a pause on his way to Geophysical Institute at UAF. He did some really neat work on the Blue Glacier, measuring the temperature of a temperate glacier. You might think the answer to be simple, melting point by definition, but not so for a mixture of ice, water, air, and multiple trace constituents. Will's paper is a classic that promoted a lot of new thinking about temperate ice. Will showed his skill in making very precise measurements at the very edge of what was possible. A cherished triple point cello was a critical component. Will later told me that one of his fondest memories of residence in Seattle was hearing wind in the masts of sailboats moored in Lake Washington, just across the street from the house rented by Will and Ann. It was a reminder of his maritime childhood on the shores of Bay of Fundy. Will and Ann arrived in Fairbanks in early 1972 and adapted to the challenges of cold weather. Will settled into his GI office surrounded by interesting colleagues. Once he could take his eyes off the beautiful view of the Alaska Range, he got right to work. Will recognized glaciers with pulsing flow called surging glaciers as a hot topic, ready for some good observation. I got involved too. We chose variegated glacier near Yakutat based on a whole slew of reasons. It worked out. We invested in complete surge cycles to the slow evolution during the long quiescence and the rapid changes during the short surge. We learned a lot about how to model the slow and normal flow of glaciers, the switching between slow and fast flow, the crucial element of basal motion and water drainage there. The latter helped by arrival of Caltech and their drilling technology. We learned that the bottom of variegated glacier was a very messy, distinctly different from the assumptions in any theoretical representation at the time. It was an amazing adventure over more than a decade. UA and UW were a closely coordinated team. Will had a pronounced influence on me as well as on a number of graduate students who worked with me at UW. One of Will's many contributions to the observational work was the time-lapse photography, which Carl mentioned. It was aimed to span the full year and capture glacier speed over the intervals that we were not present. Not so difficult now with modern digital cameras, but a challenging job in a cold, harsh climate in those days of film photography. Will's instructions to us for setting out cameras and changing the film were to say at a minimum several Hail Marys to ward off the gremlins and other hazards like bears and avalanches. After variegated glacier was even more passionate about basal processes. Over many years, he and UA colleagues, including Keith Eckelmeyer and Martin Trufer, developed an impressive array of new technologies for looking at what is actually happening at the bottom of glaciers. Choosing the Black Rapids Glacier for one of the most intense investigations of the base and associated hydrology of a glacier. They also launched a major effort to measure the loss of glacier mass in essentially all of Alaska using airborne laser altimetry and old maps. The changes turned out to be the most significant regional sources for global sea level rise in the measured time interval. We'll also engage in study of ice streams in Greenland and Antarctica with relevance to potential for large rapid sea level rises, other programs too. Through Will's research career, he was known for a willingness to tackle big challenges, creativity and adaptability, careful measurement, elegant mathematical analysis, precise language, very clearly written papers and presentations, a very complete scientist. Also a very vibrant personality. Soon after Fairbanks' arrival, Will and Ann settled into their long-term residence on Rosy Creek Road. It was a wonderful platform for setting out on multiple adventures, local walks on the Tanawha, Tanana River, raising her 2 sons, and sheltering a menagerie of pets. As well, it became a welcoming community center for locals and an internationally known hostel for glaciologists and other visitors from afar, sometimes all at once. It was busy, so many enjoyed the generous hospitality of Will and Ann. I enjoyed eating many grand meals there. One of Will's endearing traits was to recognize and embrace distinctive traits in others. For me, he recognized a ravenous appetite for salads. Will made everyone around the table aware. Under full disclosure, I nevertheless would proceed with my heavy consumption, alleviating any concerns about leftover salad. I spent many comfortable nights there as well. There were sometimes surprises. Have you ever been awakened in the night needing to engage a ferret in a tug of war? I have, in order to maintain possession of my toothbrush. I suspect there are a lot of ferret stories. The line of Harrison dogs was also quite interesting. I remember especially Nuri from a long time ago, who would roll a ball toward anyone entering the house as a challenge to play. In the photos streamed earlier, there is a picture of Nuri reading the Journal of Glaciology. It was published in ICE, the IGS news sheet, a good example of Will's creative playfulness. I will let you imagine how that photo was engineered. Will tried to bring a lively humor to almost all occasions. He had a warm heart. It was great fun to be with him. I cautiously conclude with some metaphysical musings. Wherever Will's physical remains are placed in the long term, they will be spread around the world by moving air and water. They will be flushing in and out of the Bay of Fundy, residing in the layers of the ice sheets, in the water draining through temperate glaciers, passing through the pore space of subglacial materials. In fact, in all of humanity, certainly true. Of course, these bits of will be very dilute, and identification with will be tenuous. Nevertheless, I feel it quite cool to think of Will's remains coursing through the places Will loved and uniquely explored. Will might find it so as well. However, more likely, if Will were fully here, his eyes would be rolling, head shaking, and thinking, Charlie, get yourself together. To bring me back to my senses, I can imagine Will suggesting that Anne prepare a really big salad, including an extra portion of her bacon-based dressing, so not to be overly healthful. I think today we will be showing that Will is still quite concentrated in our community consciousness. It will last. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charlie.
I hope that got through.
Yes, it
Sid,
did.
you're on my screen very strongly. Did it get through? Did you hear me?
Yes, we did.
Okay, thanks.
Great. Yeah, I think Charlie must not have the audio on, but I think we all heard him. The next one I have here on the list is another old-time friend, and I think his last collaborator, if I'm correct, on a project, which is Jim Dixon.
Well, yes, unlike many of you, I got to know Will actually through my my wife, Mim, who was a very dear friend of Ann's. And Will and I, of course, were colleagues and fellow faculty members at UAF for many, many years, but we really never had the opportunity to work in the field together. But we always shared a very interesting relationship. I'm an archaeologist, and Will was always very interested in history and archaeology, and we would always get engaged in things that we both knew very little about, like Egyptology and those sort of esoteric topics. But so for the few years, the first years that I knew Will, I knew him more as a family man, a friend, and colleague, and I was always impressed by his fantastic ability to juggle all the crazy things in his life and maintaining his house on Rosie Creek Road, from repairing his cars to fixing everything imaginable. The guy was ingenious. I couldn't believe it. as a fellow Fairbanks resident trying to raise a family as well, I always admired his ability to juggle all these things and raise such fine boys as Danny and Thomas, who were also peers of our children going to school. And we shared many experiences with both Ann and Will over the years. Many of the most memorable with their hospitality at their home in Fairbanks overlooking the Tanana River. It was just wonderful. But I never had an opportunity to work with Will in the field until after he retired. And I was doing a project in the Wrangell-St. Elias range on the northern side, looking at small patches of perennial snow and ice that had persisted for thousands of years. And people had gone to these ice patches in the ancient past to hunt caribou and other animals. And in the process, they had lost arrows and tools and bits of clothing that had remained frozen in the ice for hundreds, thousands of years in some cases. But it was fascinating. And of course, this piqued Will's interest as well. And he volunteered to join me and help me figure out why these features were there, how they came to be formed and kind of their life histories and so forth. Very important part of the story of the lives of people living in that area. And we had some great times in the field together and with great enjoyment. One of the things that came out of that project was an exhibit, a museum exhibit. And I'd like to show a picture, if we can, Kelly, of that I sent in. It's not necessarily a great photo of Will, but I did want to share this with everyone because this was taken in 2007 at one of the ice patches that we were working at. And you can see in the foreground, one of our collaborators, Albert Craig from Copper Center, one of the native colleagues working with the site with us, had just found a perfectly preserved arrow, a wooden arrow with feathers attached and so forth. Very exciting moment. This is the kind of artifact you don't find very often. And of course, Albert was delighted, and Will is in the background. And the reason I wanted to share this photo is because in the exhibit that was produced about this work, Will's photo is in that exhibit. And so I wanted to, and there's two forms of the exhibit. One is at Copper Center at the Otna Heritage Center in Copper Center. So if any of you are passing through Copper Center and you want to see Will, you can drop in there and you can see him in action in his senior field research times. And also there's a traveling exhibit with Will's photo in it that's going around the country. It's currently in Yellowstone National Park, but it's been in northern Kansas University and Northern Illinois University and in other museums around the country. So you can think of Will as still with us in many ways. Of course, he lives on through his publications and others' research, but he's also touring the country in this exhibit as well. So we always think of Will fondly, and particularly his family and his wonderful hospitality and his great intellect, wit, and sense of humor.
Thank you so much, Tim, for that. The next one we have here is somebody who goes back to Variegated Glacier, I think, with Will. That's Tad Pfeffer.
There we go. Okay, now we've got sound. Well, Will was, I think, one of my very closest personal friends among my professional colleagues. I first met him in 1980 at Variegated Glacier. And oddly enough, Variegated was the only glacier that I actually worked on with Will. But I was there with him for, from 1980 to when the whole thing, when the main project wrapped up around 1986. And the memories that I have of him are mainly of somebody who was completely unflappable. Will's just permanent calm. No matter what happened, he could always manage the situation without going off the handle. I really admired that. It was not a quality that I always had. And that was also an era before we had satellite phones and so forth. And we'd go into the glacier, and the only communication you'd have was by letter, which would come in occasionally when people flew in and out. And I remember one time we were all sitting in the main tent, and Will was reading a letter from home, and Anne was describing what was happening around the house. And Will says something about, he had to go into the hospital all of a sudden, and they had to do emergency surgery, and they took almost 2 pounds of bone out of his stomach. And I was, kind of appalled. And it was a couple of minutes before I understood that they were talking about a dog. He was, I think, the clearest memory, and probably the most representative I have of him, was when I first arrived at Variegated Glacier. This would be in July of 1980. And Will and others were already in there. I'd flown up from Seattle. This is my first time to Alaska, my first time meeting anybody but Charlie, who I had met the previous fall at a meeting. So everybody and everything was new to me. And I flew in the little Hiller helicopter that was based in Yakutat at that time. Ira was not in there at that point. And I flew into the glacier with Liz Senior. And we were carrying a sling load at the same time. And the helicopter was really at its limit. And the pilot had to fly. He'd fly a couple hundred meters, and then he'd have to set down the load, the net, on the ground and rest for a minute. And then he could pick up and he could fly a little bit further and set down. And then when we got up onto the glacier, it was raining, of course, this heavy cloud cover everywhere. And we start very slowly working our way up the glacier, carrying this load. And once we get above the snow line, I see this line of tracks. There's just steps going up the Fern. And between this sort of slow progress of the helicopter and the clouds and the rain, and these steps were sort of the only thing we could see in the snow. They just went on forever. And of course, from the snow line up to the main camp in Variegated is, I don't know what it was, 5 kilometers maybe, watching these steps go by, step after step after step. And finally, when we arrived and close to camp, here was this man walking along in white bunny boots and a snow shovel. And that was Will. And that line of tracks just going forever up the Fern was, that sort of created my first impression of Will. And it was one that has lasted ever since. As somebody who could just keep going. And I will really miss him. Thanks.
Thanks, Tad. For a second, I thought it was Austin Post who showed up on the video there.
Could have been.
It's great to see you. The next one we have on the list here is Andy Money.
Yeah, hi everyone. For those who don't know me, I'm another professor here at UAF, and I've only known Will for 20 years or so. I met him when I came to UAF as a student in 2000, and I have several fond memories that bring a smile to my face or just an outright laugh when I think of some of the off-color jokes that Will would tell at the family-oriented GI Christmas parties, or some of the unrepeatable jokes he told me as we were driving down to help Martin on his fieldwork in Black Rapids when Will and I were driving one of the GI vehicles down to meet them at the lodge. But my abiding memory of Will is one of generosity. From when I first met him, and this is echoing a comment that Martin made earlier, he really kind of treated me as an equal. He was this grand old, he was emeritus professor at that time, clearly highly respected within the group, though I didn't understand his reputation when I first met him. And yet he treated me as an equal with genuine interest in my science and over time, my progress as a scientist in my career. So my field of research is a fringe branch of glaciology. To many people here, I study sea ice. And so I'd like to comment on how Will, I think, to this day is still the only researcher in the snow ice permafrost group at UAF who has studied glaciers, sea ice, snow, and permafrost. He is also the only person I know of who has ever surfed a piece of sea ice as it rode up the beach and onto the land, something most people would be perhaps too cautious of doing. But this is a story I should claim. I never saw myself, but Lou Shapiro, who I believe is listening in, has described it to me in some vivid detail. And I guess just lastly, I'd like to bring up maybe a sad point, but just recently I came across a research article of Will's written before I was born on subsea permafrost. And this is a topic that I am just starting to get interested in myself. The sort of the intersection between where sea ice meets the land, there's permafrost underneath it. There's tremendous concern right now for the future global implications of thawing of subsea permafrost. And yet there's remarkably little work done on it. And as I was trying to find some fundamental details, up pops a paper written by Will Harrison before I was born. And it tore me up a bit that I couldn't just go up to his office and talk to him about it in person like I would have done just what seems so recently. But I'm going to miss Will. He's one of the people I aspire to be as a scientist and as a person.
Very well said, Andy. Thank you. I think next we have Roman Motika, another long-term colleague.
Hi, thanks. Calling in from Juneau. You hear me okay?
Yes, you're good.
Right. Yeah, hey, I think we all know Will was just an amazing dude, and it is definitely my privilege to have worked with him and be his friend. My first field experience with Will was way back in 1974 when they first started the Variegated Glacier Project. That was a multi-week expedition, and it was quite amazing. And a great introduction for me to glacier field work in Alaska with Will and Charlie as mentors. And it's also the time I learned about Will's legendary frugality, which extended even to rationing of toilet paper. Will was a mentor, a friend, and a colleague, and Will and Ann were among the very first people I met when I first arrived in Fairbanks. That was back in August 1973. He was on my PhD committee, and I quickly learned how adept Will was with his famous back-of-the-envelope analysis. His door was always open for consultation and for just shooting the breeze about glaciers and life in general, as we've heard from others. Will is also a great recycler, and people know he was also a great mechanic. Just as an example, this is back in the mid-70s. I had a beater Volvo P122. It blew a piston, and together with other problems, the car just wasn't worth fixing. But Will owned a similar Volvo, and he eagerly accepted my gift of my broken Volvo, and he used it for spare parts. He stripped the car clean, and then to boot, he used a shell to help line a leach pit for his septic system. Great recycler. Over the years, whenever I would visit Fairbanks from Juneau, Will and Ann always offered me a place to stay there. As we've learned, their hospitality was legendary. And the last time I visited Fairbanks and stayed with Will was about 3 winters ago. And that occasion was the wedding of Elliot, the son of his dear friends, Robin and Paula. I know Will was close to Elliot, and he was so happy that Elliot had found his soulmate, who just happened to be my goddaughter too. That was Alexis. So I'm really sorry to see Will go, and he'll be well remembered for everything he's done. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Roman. Next on the list, we have Tully, who was a graduate student here a long time ago.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great,
We see the
thank you.
aurora behind you.
Yes. So thank you very much for the opportunity to pay respect to Will Harrison. I was a graduate student in the years 1995 to 98, so I arrived at the same time as Martin. So we shared an office for a few years. So that was great. We can remember that at another time. But Will was a great mentor, supervisor, and a later friend, together with his wife, Anne. My heart is filled with gratitude when thinking to the Harrisons for the opportunities they offered and the ways that we could learn from Will's thoughtful, considerate, and brilliant way of doing science. Observing him, Will, write and rewrite papers was an excellent schooling that has followed me ever since. Will was a really good role model, humorous and welcoming person that invited us, the graduate students, to his home, where we also became friends with Anne, sharing food and creating memories. And Will welcomed me to Fairbanks before I even got there. He wrote in an email that I could come and be a student on the LASER project if I agreed to be a field assistant for Bernard Rapus on McCall Glacier the summer before. And he probably thought I would say no, thank you, but I was excited enough about the prospects of going to Alaska that I agreed to the deal. I went with Bernard and Keith and Susan and Trabant to McCall Glacier in the Brooks Range for a few weeks. And this was a great adventure, and you could see some filming from that location before that the event started. And the trip ended in a nerve-wracking waiting for a pickup at the Jacob Lake. But Will also introduced me to my first landlords in Fairbanks, Rob and Pauline Wilson, and for that I'm very grateful. It was a wonderful place to live in their round cabin. And Will also introduced me to my neighbor, John, who I thought, after discussing the email exchange with Will, with my friends here in Reykjavik, was the outhouse. This is what the Americans call outhouses, right? John's. So when I arrived, I was delighted to meet John Powers in addition to my outhouse. And when I arrived to go to the round cabin, Will had arranged that Danny Harrison picked me up at the airport. And with a stop at Fred Meyer's, he brought me to the round cabin below the Wilson house. So this was a really wonderful welcoming to come to Fairbanks and being brought to my future house. And Will was such a great help and support in the first few weeks in Fairbanks. He took me to the car sales places and made sure I had my own car to drive around from Rosie Creek. And in the following years, I learned many things from him. I'm grateful and very happy to have so good memories. When Will and Anne visited in Copenhagen, we walked by the Niels Bohr Institute. And for me, it was an old building, and I realized that for Will, this was a pilgrimage. I'm very happy that we had also a few weeks together in spring and summer 2019, when I enjoyed again Will and Anne's hospitality and friendship. Thank you, Will, and thank you, Anne. We keep those good memories in our hearts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tolly. Next we have Bob Binchadler, another Variegated Days connection, I think.
Yeah, that certainly permeates my experience with Will. For me, the one thing that always puzzled me about Will was that his PhD was in nuclear physics, and never quite understood that. But I think one of the best things for all of us was when Will caught the bug to do glaciology, because it really was a perfect fit, I think, for everything that Will was and everything he shared with all of us through that vehicle of glaciology, and in my particular case, field glaciology, brought out the best in Will. And I think really made him such a special person in all of our lives. And as Martin said, I'm part of the folks that spend a lot of their time on variegated glaciology. For me, it was where I did my thesis work. So my years there in 1973 to 1978 were as a starting as a Greenhorn graduate student and learning the whole trade of field glaciology from Charlie and Will was absolutely perfect for me. I think Tad hit the nail on the head when he characterized Will as being unflappable, and the humor that he brought to those days spent on what usually was a very rainy, soggy glacier that we were having to wait years for before it surged. In fact, I never did see it surge. You needed people like Will and Charlie, I think, to really carry that project forward for all the years that they did and all that was learned as a result of it. I think Will and Charlie were a perfect partnership too, because each brought such strong qualities that are needed for any field research project in such a remote and challenging environment. So my fondest memories really of Will are founded in those days that we spent on Variegated Glacier. And I think we all know that bonds that are created in field experiences like that really last a lifetime. And I'm impressed too with so many people being in on this call. It's clear how extensive and how many people Will touched in his life. And I think he enjoyed himself in the field, and that was so obvious. And it was a good lesson for a Greenhorn graduate student like me to see and learn. He enjoyed himself and he enjoyed others in that setting. My particular memories that I'll recall from those Variegated Glacier days include Will's willingness to do all the unpleasant tasks. I think this speaks to what was said about him treating everybody as an equal. Some of the pictures I contributed to really sort of capture my visual image of Will in his green rain suit with his big white bunny boots and that yellow sou'wester hat that he could turn one way or another depending on the weather. You knew whether it was a sunny day and he had the sou'wester with the big brim out in front protecting his face, or if it was a rainy day, he had it turned around the other way and the long sou'wester brim would prevent the rain from going down his neck. Slogging through that wet snow day after day after day. It may be a little bit off color, but one of the tasks that he seemed to really take to, in fact, he was very protective of this, was burning the deposits in the crap barrel. We had a 55-gallon barrel with a plywood ring tied on top, and that was what amounted to our outhouse in those days. You took out your umbrella when you were going to spend time there. But every week or so, it needed to be burned down, and that was something that Will just seemed to love to do. You wanted to be sure that your task that day took you upwind and not downwind on those days. But come back to camp, and Will just had this enormous grin on his face with shovel and just stirring what was in the barrel and making sure that it was all burning down appropriately. And he had one other thing that I remember in particular. Somehow or other, I mean, the meals were simple on Variegated Glacier. We're talking mountain house, freeze-dried dinners were sort of the typical evening fare, and simple. And just one dish meals, and you would generally eat it with a spoon. And somehow or other, we got into this initially unspoken competition about who was going to have the most ornate spoon as their eating utensil. And this went on for years, and from one season to the next, some of the return researchers would come with an ever more ornate spoon. But I can't remember where Will found it, but he clearly won the competition in one particular year. He came to the glacier with a huge spoon that was just incredibly ornate. He had found it at some yard sale someplace. And so we declared him the winner of the competition. Nobody could compete with what he had found. But that was the kind of humor that he brought sort of day in, day out to the glacier. And that, as much as anything, is what I will miss, his cheery disposition, his humor, his friendship. And he was truly a remarkable man and colleague. And I will dearly miss him. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob, and really good to see you here too. I think next we have Liz.
Hi. Well, like some of the other people, I first met Will in the Variegated Glacier too when I arrived with Charlie in 1979 and stayed friends with he and then later Anne for years, visited him in Fairbanks a lot. And I have to say, Will is the only person in my life I've survived both the helicopter crash and a car accident down in Will with. And I have to say, in the helicopter crash, we were in a snow cave for 24 hours in the Variegated Glacier, hoping to get rescued. And as someone mentioned, Will's calm gave me total confidence that everything was going to turn out okay. You know, just he knew what he was doing, and it did turn out okay. But that was great having him there. And the only memory I was going to share was kind of way back to Variegated Glacier days. And the 4 years I worked at Variegated Glacier, I was responsible for all the provisioning, and I tried my best to get the absolute best food I could get given the circumstances. And Will, of course, was happy with Mountain House dinners. And I soon found that this effort was somewhat lost in Will because he would eat anything and everything and didn't care what it was as long as it was calories. And I came back to the tent one day and he was eating a snack that was something like crackers with peanut butter, mustard sardines, and the gelatin from the ham can on top, and said it was really good. So my provisioning was kind of lost on Will. So that was kind of one of my memories.
Yeah, I think anybody who was in the field with Will can relate to that story. And also to the legendary helicopter crashes. And I see Dan is on. Are you on your ship somewhere?
Yes. Yes, we're actually down in Wilmington, North Carolina on our boat. But it's a real privilege to be able to get a chance to say how much Will meant to me and Diana. We both worked for Will early on. I was met Will in the late 70s when Carl Benson hired me into the glaciology group, me and a bunch of other hired ice axes to do glaciology field work, and then I got to know Will much better on the Variegated in the summer of 1982. I just finished my undergraduate degree in physics at UAF, and was out there after the boarded surge and working with Will in the rain and in the slop and the cracked up ice. And it was just amazing to me how he just this big guy would just climb over these cracks, and it was pretty impressive to me. And he just sort of did it, took it all in stride. But the feel, and it was because I was going into physics, and so I was talking to him about his work at the Kellogg Lab, and we'd go from talking about physics and life and doing research in the lab to then working out in the field. And Will would pull out his stub of a pencil. He always seemed to have a stub of a pencil when he'd write in his notebook. And then we'd come up to one of his cameras, which is one of the most lasting memories for me. Is Will would open up one of these cameras. There'd be a problem, and he would never get real upset, but he'd pull out his Swiss Army knife and he'd start messing with these cameras. And the thing to realize is that this is experimental science. To me, that was my real first experience of how difficult it was to actually do something. I mean, you can say, well, you just set up a camera and take a picture once a day. It's easy to say, but at that time, and still today, at that time, it hadn't been done. And Will had these little watches, and he had the cameras, and they were filming the cameras, and you had to keep the camera warm enough so it would work, and you had to have enough battery power, all of these things just to take a picture. And they were constantly failing. And Will would, I remember him opening up this camera, pulling out his Swiss Army knife, and there was a contact that was bad. And so he pulled out some solder, wrapped it around the wiring, and then pulled out a match, and he soldered with a match. And I had never seen anyone do that. And he would just magically fix these cameras. And that's a memory that just really sticks with me. Is over the years, I'd be in the lab when he was working on these cameras, and there'd be a dozen of them or so. And I might not have been there for a year or so. And I'd walk in and either I'd be in Will's office talking to Will, and you'd hear a little alarm go off or a camera click. And Will would just get up and dash out to check and make sure what had done, it had worked right, which one of the dozen of cameras. And anyone who was in the lab during that time, you were driven crazy by these alarms and cameras going off all the time. But it really struck me as that the care and the hard work it took to really make something work in the field. And I took that with me to graduate school, and whenever I was dealing with difficult problems, I remembered how Will would solve these, and I'd be in the lab and I'd think, at least it's not raining and snowing on me. And so I just really admired that and his real sharp intellect and great wit. Great guy to be in the field with. And I do miss him. And thank you, Anne, for letting Will be with all of us all those years. And bless you.
Thank you, Dan. Next here we have Olaf Eisen, who wrote me an email earlier and said that he's going to be in a train at this time and won't be able to speak. I don't know if he's listening, but he just sent me a short statement and asked me to read that, so I'll do that. He says, I owe Will a lot. With his calming patience for an impatient German student who did not like fractions as exponents in some glaciological parametrizations, he introduced me to glaciology. Allowing me to join the Black Rapids field campaign, he laid the foundation for my career as a field glaciologist, put the Black Rapids airstrip and Harrison's blue family van in my memory, and finally taught me how to write scientific papers, luckily before I started a PhD, to bring together searches on climate. Without his support, my life as a glaciologist would be very different today. This is Olaf Eisen, who's a glaciologist at the Alfred Wegener Institute and came here as an undergraduate to work with Will, and then later on went on to PhD and a very successful career in glaciology. So that was from him. Then I think the next one I have here is John Morak, another longtime colleague here in Fairbanks. Are you on, John?
I'm unmuted, I think. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, you're good. We can hear you.
Thanks, Martin. I got to know Will in the early 70s when he came to UAF. And, the things I remember about him was his unbelievable professional competence. I mean, everybody knows how really clever the guy was. His generosity to students and colleagues was something you just don't see in most people. He had a terrific sense of adventure, which I managed to use a little bit. And he had a keen interest in history, which I did too. He and I had many adventures. We explored Scott's and Shackleton's huts in Antarctica. And after we retired, we got to talking one day and he said, I want to go to Egypt. And I said, well, I want to go to Kenya. And he said, well, let's go to both of them. So we did. We spent a month in Africa. And then another adventure we had, we went down to McCarthy. This is, before when we drove the cable car across the river. And he had found out about a way to get into the Kennecott mine by going up over the hill. So we walked up there, went down the other side, camped overnight, and crawled in an air vent in the back of the mine. And we spent the whole day in there in the dark, just looking over all the stuff. It was a terrific adventure. One other adventure I'd like to share with you. I took a sabbatical in the 80s with Jim Hunter in Ottawa, and they had a subsea permafrost program up at Tuktoyaktuk. And when I came back the next year, he invited me to come over there. And so I went up to see Will. I said, "You got anything we can do over there? They'll host us." So he came up with the idea. They had a bunch of holes drilled offshore. The oil companies had roads plowed all over out on the ice. They ran cats out there, and you could get 40, 50 miles offshore And Hunter had gone up there and drilled a water jetted a bunch of holes. And Will said, let's take a heater over there and put it down one of those holes. And they already had them instrumented with thermometers and stuff. So his idea was just to put a heater down there, and we figured out we could determine where it was actually, where the layer was actually by the heat that we put into the subsea. And so the first adventure was just getting there. And in March, we had to drive to Whitehorse and then up the highway to Dawson, then on up to Inuvik, and then you go down the Mackenzie River and drive on the ocean on the road that the oil companies that plowed over to Tuktoyaktuk. And Hunter had a camp over there with a bunch of people, and he got us a couple skidoos, and they had a dancing sled with a big wooden box on it. And so Will and I headed offshore early one morning, and we had a generator and enough food for the day and all that stuff. We got out there and started looking at the data coming in, and Will says, well, we ought to maybe just let this thing run a little bit longer. So I said, well, okay, I'll go back to camp. It was about 30 miles back to camp on a snow machine. And I said, well, I'll go back to camp and get us some food. So I headed in. I got about halfway in, and here's this big crack in the ice, and there's a huge bulldozer there. It's sitting at about a 20-degree angle with its blade down in the water, idling with nobody on it. And so I fiddled around for a while, and I found a place across the crack in the ice. And I got in there, and they said, oh yeah, the guy left it. He was afraid of what was going to happen. Well, it broke the ice, and the cat went to the bottom of the water. So they wouldn't let me go back. They wouldn't let me go back out. And I said, well, Harrison's out there all by himself. He hasn't got anything in. I said, no, you can't go. You got to wait till tomorrow till we make it sure it's safe enough for you to go back out there. So I got a nice hot dinner and went to bed and got up at real early in the morning. And I said, you gonna let me go now? And they said, yep, you can go now. So I got some food and some hot coffee and stuff and headed out there. And it was still dark when I got there. And there he was sitting there with the generator running. And he must have stayed up all night long. I mean, that wooden box wasn't good enough to sleep in or anything, And so I said, well, I got some food here for you, Will, And if it had been me, I know the first thing I would have said is, where the heck have you been? Nothing. He says, I'll have a cup of coffee. And I said, after sitting there for a little while, I said, don't you want to know what happened? Why the heck I didn't come back out? I didn't mean to leave you here. And it was just, that really summed up Will. It didn't bother him a bit. He says he figured, something had come up, but he wasn't even concerned about it. And that's just, to me, that just summed up him in one sentence. What a guy. I'm really privileged that I got to know the guy, work with him and play with him. And ending here, I just want to thank Martin for putting together this terrific opportunity. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, John, for sharing this. We got Mindy Brugman. Is she on?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear and see you. Hi, Mindy.
Great. Oh, thanks for including me. I'm Mindy Brugman, and I was a grad student at Caltech working with Barclay when I first got to know Will. Even was able to go up and visit him when we went up on a trip up to the Arrogage Peaks. And I just remember Will being so busy rubbing the back of his son and realizing what a wonderful father that he was. But this story is a story from the Variegated. So it's my memory. I might not be perfect, but here I go. June 1983, during the surge of Variegated Glacier. Unlike other people who waited many years before the surge, I just arrived to do an experiment that happened to be right during the surge. So here we go. And if Kelly wants to show some of the pictures, that might help people. Yeah, this is Herman is on this call too. This is a picture Al Marican took of the Variegated, probably from Moose Mound there. This is what it looked like when we were doing this thing. So it started on a nice sunny day, just a jaunt up to do some surveying in the upper variegated glacier. The glacier was surging at about 100 meters a day and cracking up all over the place. So a helicopter was needed. The pilot and Will Harrison, Herman Engelhardt, and a new student who was having his first day on the glacier flew to the upper glacier. First, they dropped off the student alone out in the glacier and zipped over for a quick drop off on the margin. Suddenly, the helicopter was landing, but the snow blew up and the pilot lost his visibility, and the tilted chopper rotor blade caught an edge, and within a few seconds, they flipped over and the chopper crashed on the snowy mountainside above the gaping crevasses. No problem, since all were safe and the chopper was intact. The student was safe for now. Will stayed calm and prepared for what he knew could be a long, cold stay. However, right then it was a nice sunny day. The rescue chopper was called and hurriedly rushed up with people who claimed they knew where they were going. I saw them leave from the hangar in Yakutat just as I arrived, and they were racing up to the glacier and said they didn't need any help. They knew the way, or so they thought. The time was of the essence as another storm was closing in fast. And unfortunately, the rescue helicopter team accidentally went up the Hubbard Glacier and never even saw the camp on the variegated. By the time they came back to Yakutat and went back in with me, the weather had socked in, so they dropped me off at the camp and went back to Yakutat. In the meantime, the crash crew collected themselves. Will had prepared them for the unlikely worst case scenario because that's just Will. He was awesome and calm. No one was hurt. He got all started checking supplies and ensuring their survival. The pilot had a Playboy magazine and loafer shoes and was not equipped for winter camping. Herman was okay for himself, but not for a long stay. And the student on the glacier had 9 almonds and a tape measure. Promptly, Will got them all digging caves just in case. The student survived a couple days there in his little body-sized cave. Herman kept up the conversations with the student below via radio. The student was rescued by Keith Eckelmeyer, Barclay Cam, and me by skiing up the glacier to get him through the broken up glacier labyrinth in snow and fog. Lily Mesker-Welgen was at the campsite, maintained the radio communication relays. Will kept all safe and had such a calming and confident influence that better ensured safety for all. Will was well prepared for his winter emergency bag to help all, and he had those ubiquitous white rubber military style bunny boots. The snow cave he directed they promptly dig at the crash site had passageways and alcoves for each person, and they could pass the Playboy magazine pages and bits of food around and warm clothing. They passed the time with ease. It took another 2 days for the helicopter to make it back in to pick them up. When it arrived, the crash victims were found safe, cozy, and peaceful, largely due to Will Harrison. We, Keith, Barclay, and me, saw the chopper take off just as we reached the student, draped in his silver emergency blanket on a block of ice. It was due to Will that they all did so well and even had a memorable time. Then Will went off to a survey perch high on the mountain above our camp to follow the surging glacier. What a guy, what a loving father and spouse, and what a great mentor. I wish his wife and his children he loves so much, and his students and colleagues my condolences. Thanks for sharing them with me. And he was a Canuck, no wonder. Will was a breed unto himself and will be greatly missed. Thank you.
Thank you, Mindy. What a story. I like the end to it of like it's all done, go off surveying. I think most people would be done for the season at that point. Do we have Cliff Moore on?
I am here.
Well,
Do you
there
hear
might be
me?
some more camera stories, I suspect. Huh.
I am unmuted, apparently.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, good. Okay. Yeah, camera stories. I've heard camera stories and I've heard helicopter stories. I'll try to. I've got some of those too. I was fortunate enough to be an undergrad biology student at the University of Alaska. And I like to go out on the weekends and play in the mountains. And this sort of put me in a position, because I was familiar with being able to move on glaciers, put me in a position to be useful with the glaciology department. And I was willing to carry 10-foot long sticks of steel conduit, which were used as poles. We'd drill these ice holes down with his ice drill, backpack mounted ice drill, and stack layer after layer, like 30 feet of pole. And then as the glacier would melt down, we'd go up the next year and pull some of those poles out. It was fantastic. And then the cameras, we would take, I have the privilege of being delivered perfectly good Olympus cameras. And I would just immediately start tearing them apart. And we would modify them, hook up these Casio alarm clocks and put them out on the glaciers. Then I was fortunate enough again to be able to reduce the film using a big digitizing table. And one of my proudest accomplishments in my career is the publication of the variegated glacier surge data. It's fantastic. I think about that often. In fact, I even pull it out and look at it every now and again. Hard to believe. I guess I should tell the helicopter story, because, well, it's just another one of his helicopter stories. We were digging a snow pit way up in the, I think it was way up in the top of the Black Rapids drainage. And it was time to leave. The visibility was horrible. And it was like a last chance, or we're gonna be spending the night. And the helicopter pilot got us off the ground, got us headed down the glacier. And then the glacier sort of caught up with us, and we went head over and flipped upside down. And cool under fire. He's just, I mean, you spend the night on the glacier with a guy, and you get to see who they are. He's unflappable. It was a marvelous. It turned out to be a very memorable experience. Nobody was seriously injured, and we got rescued the next morning. So I'm just so thankful to Will for all of the opportunities, for all the confidence he had in me. Gave me great opportunities, and I'm my condolences to his family, and I'm so sorry, but he was a wonderful man. I love the guy, and that's all there is to it. Thank you.
Yeah, that's all there is to it. Thank you, Cliff. Anuma Prakash just sent an email, and she's sitting in a Board of Regents meeting. So which is also going over time, and so she can't make it. She's the provost here of UAF, and she just said, please express my apologies for missing the event. I wanted to share that we all at the university really miss Will. He had infinite curiosity and positivity. I worked with him and still miss those days when we sat together and discussed ideas. Will was fascinated by new technologies in mapping. He was so willing to share his expertise and also to learn. It was a true joy to work with him. I miss his smile, humor, and his presence in my life. Thank you for that, Anupma. And then next we have an overseas visitor again, Pippa McKeith.
Hello. Yes,
Hello.
all the way
Yes,
from
we can hear
Nottingham in England, in the UK. So Will became a cherished friend to our family after my brother Peter died in 1980, doing what he loved, climbing in the mountains of Alaska. Will was his supervisor at the time and had the unenviable task of breaking the shocking news to us in the UK. organising a funeral and looking after us while we stayed in Fairbanks, with lots of others looking after us too. Will was a very special friend to my mother, Elizabeth, who visited Alaska many times. And in 2000, I visited with her and my own family. We had many adventures with all our very hospitable Alaskan friends. And one was our trip to Kennecott, which we've heard a lot about. And this was organised to a T, this trip, by Anne. My mother, aged 91, had a bed in the hotel, and we took it in turns to eat with her there in the evenings. The rest of us camped on hard ground, and each night hoping the bears wouldn't find us and looking for the aurora in the sky. Will's enthusiasm was infectious for this place that he loved. Elizabeth insisted on coming on the walk to the glacier, or glacier, as you say. Will was thoughtful and respectful and very practical. He made sure he was right behind her all the way. And when she stumbled, he helped her back on her feet, and on we went. He coined the phrase, "She likes to think she's independent." The last time we saw Will was in 2011, 4 months before my mother died, aged 102. We were spending a week in Snowdonia in North Wales, here in the UK, a place that my mother loved. And Will, who happened to be in Europe, joined us for a few days, much to my mother's joy. On a walk with Will up a Welsh mountain, a small hill to him, I remember him asking me about the plants around us. And I realized that these plants were so familiar to me that I no longer noticed them. It was exciting to have to see them with fresh eyes and to notice their variety. It's been such a pleasure and a privilege to know Will. So thoughtful and respectful, practical and very good company. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and I think a lot of especially the women in the GI will remember his love for flowers every spring when the lady slippers showed up on their desks. Another fond memory. I think next we have Gail Davidson, another long-time friend.
I guess I'm unmuted.
Yes, you're good.
In 1978, I thought perhaps it was time for me to try a PhD in glaciology. So I applied to the University of Alaska, and Will called me on the phone one day when I was at work and actually talked me into coming. He told me, though, that I shouldn't bring my dog because it would be hard to find a place to live. My reply to that was, well, without my dog, I'm not coming. So my dog and I arrived in Fairbanks, and Will turned out to love my dog. My dog and Nuri turned out to be the best of friends. And so that was a good start. It turned out that shouldn't say I followed Will up Logan. His route was way too difficult for me. But about 3 years later than he did, I did climb Mount Logan. And that gave us something to talk about. But interestingly, more years later than 3, I'd been in Zurich at the ETH before I came to Alaska, and he followed me there, and we met many of the same friends. I lived next door to Will for a long time, and even after I moved from that house, I lived very close to him. He loved my kids, he loved my dogs, all of them. My kids loved him. Jody said, "Oh, I'll miss Will. He was so funny." But we talk about anything. I mean, I never did finish that PhD. I only spent actually 1 year at it before funding ran out. But Will never wrote me off as a non-glaciologist. He invited me to parties at his house where I've met many, many of you, the ones I didn't meet in any other way. And we spent a lot of time talking about glaciers, about snow. The only field work I ever actually did with him was at Prudhoe Bay working on permafrost. And we talked about sailing ships. We talked about history. We talked about the East Coast, both of us being Easterners. And always I was in the loop, and always we had a good time. And we went skating. We went to Kennecott. We went here, there, and everywhere. And I had lots of time at his house. But mostly he taught me how to do so many things. All the way from working on my car to working on my plumbing to all kinds of things that I don't know how to do without his help. One day he told me that, I think I really should give up this glaciology stuff and just open a garage. But I miss him a lot. When I need to know how to do something, YouTube is a really poor substitute for Will's help. Thank you.
Thank you, Gail. Do we have Dale?
Yeah. Do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, good. Hey, thank you. I met Will in 1991 in my first year here in Alaska. And so it's kind of ironic. We're having the Mars lander is landing today on Mars. So it's kind of an automotive thing that Will would appreciate. And so, but anyway, I work, he's been somebody that's very important in my life since the early 90s. And I ended up working with Will on, he hired me to work on drilling equipment for projects. And that's how I got to know, I've been involved in ice drilling before many times, but anyway, but Will had wanted drilling equipment for Black Rapids Glacier, and he asked me to get it figured out. And it was a very interesting time to work with him, and he was very much involved in every step of the drilling equipment, and he understood everything mechanical. And so we got along great with all that stuff, and I really enjoyed talking with him about machinery. And we always would, he always had car questions, or we'd always be bouncing around car questions. And, you know, I enjoyed all the trips to Black Rapids Glacier, and it was really fun to see him in the field. That always was very enjoyable time. He was very, very involved and patient, extremely patient with everything. And if there was a breakdown, he was right there. He always wanted to be involved in anything that needed to be repaired. And he was definitely a hands-on person, and I have always appreciated that. And been a very important person in my life. And I think it's probably was a good connection for my current position at the Geophysical Institute. And it's been, and I met Will one time, and I was in Antarctica on another drilling project. We met in McMurdo, and that was fun to see him there. That was back in probably 93, I think it was. But anyway, he's been an important person in my life, and it's really been interesting to put faces with names here, because I've heard stories about all of you on the Black Rapids, you know, when we're up on drilling projects. And so it's been very fun to see, because I've heard all about all of you, and I've never been able to put names with faces. I've seen a few of you I've met. So anyway, it's been good. And anyway, we have a good time. All the best. Thank you.
Thank you, Dale. And I had a similar experience. I've heard of a lot of you that I haven't met before ever. So that is really interesting to see. The next one we have here is Bob Jacobo, yet another variegated connection, I think.
Yeah, we're going to share screen here in just a minute. Is that right? Is that good? Because I have a couple of slides here. So let's see if that works. There we go.
There you go. Yeah, now you're good.
So like several others, I met Will on Variegated Glacier. I was a latecomer to the project. I went up there in 1982 and then again in 83. And now this is the site of the infamous helicopter crash at Station 19. Tom June, the pilot there, and Will with the red ear band just after it happened. And indeed, we did spend about 36 hours in a cave there. It wasn't a Playboy, it was it was a Cosmo magazine that was meant to be delivered to Liz, who was over on a different station. And so we had her mail, and among those things was the Cosmo magazine, which all of us read and then reread and then reread again. But I want to go from there to, let's see if I can, the next one. So I was pretty traumatized by the helicopter crash. I was very skittish about getting back into a helicopter, just real uncomfortable. But this is was probably taken about the same time as the cover photo for Science magazine that Mindy showed. So this was the day that Will and I went out back to Yakutat to do some business. And it was one of these just incredibly unusual, gorgeous sunny days on the glacier. And as we were flying out over the lower portion of the glacier here, you can see the Seracs in the foreground. Will spotted a corner reflector. So those of you who've done some surveying, you know what these are. It's a glass lens-like looking thing that will return a laser beam, a survey beam right back to where it's directed. And they're fairly expensive. I mean, I think Charlie could probably correct me here, but a couple hundred or several $100s anyway, even back in those days. And Will spotted one of these on a pole out here. And he wanted the pilot to land so that we could collect it and save it because it's about to fall into the abyss here. The pilot wouldn't land, but he would do a tow-in, you know, keeping under full power and bring the foot of the helicopter right up to the edge of the Serac. And so Will got out, and I think, I mean, Tad said unflappable. I think that this is just the definition of unflappable to me. He crawled out of the helicopter, and then the pilot wouldn't stay there, but he would let Will walk around as he flew away. And so there's Will out there on the Serac. The pilot came back around again after Will had collected the corner reflector, and there's Will just calmly waiting for the pilot to come down and tow in again so he can climb back into the helicopter. Okay, that's a different thing, and I want to just come back to the stop the share. Okay, that's good. So I don't know how to end after that, other than to say there's an example of Will being just completely unflappable. That's the thing that I remember most about him. We worked together in Antarctica after that, and we were on some committees later on in life. But it was those first experiences in the field that I think really exemplify what Will meant to me. Thanks.
So is Eugene on?
Yeah. I came to know Will very late in life, so I'll just give you the food story as my quick introduction to Will. I took a vacation down to Antarctica with Barclay Cam, and Keith Eckelmeyer and Will were in the adjacent project next to us. But Will made his mark one snowy day at our field camp in Outer Bravo at lunch. And the cook, Bob, had made a fine lunch. And what happened was Will came in very cold, stamping his feet, and he took a bowl and he ladled out this pot. And Bob comes over and says, "That's the sauce for the lunch." So the next day he comes in and he made this line, which we would always remember him, which was, "Is it soup or is it sauce?" And we all burst out laughing. And that was my introduction to Will Harrison. I didn't get to know Will super well except for over the time later. I certainly met Chris Larson, who I could see is there. And I was a climbing partner of Keith and Mindy and Barclays, and somebody had to break the trail after they got their PhDs. And as a JPL employee, I guess I was kind of it, even though I moved to NASA later. And I think I also met Bob and Pat from Goddard there as well too. Well, it would be some years before I would see Will again in the GI, and it was this pile of Nikon cameras. And my one camera story that I could say was, well, you know, digital cameras are coming along, and the rest is history. My last reason, though, for knowing Will relatively recently was the fact that he and I were both journal editors, although in completely different fields. And of course, we worked with both the National Science Foundation. If Will were alive now, he would love it that in recent years, I was contacted by a woman from the British Academy. And part of the reason why this woman had been to California was that she was studying the evolution of the English language. And Will would have had a fantastic time talking to her, even because the British hate what the Americans are doing to their language. And that's my last sad little bit about Will. He would really love to have had this opportunity. So that's just some short memories of Will, and I'll pass it back to you, Martin.
Yeah, thank you very much. Great story. I don't know if, what happened to Craig, so we'll just go on for now. Regine, I think, is next here.
Okay, thanks. Will was a great colleague, a dear friend, and in the last years, also my direct neighbor. And the good memories are endless. And I just want to highlight a few things that stuck with me. When he found out that I stayed at a hotel during a visit to Fairbanks before I moved there, his immediate reaction was, "Why don't you stay with us? Hotel is boring." And so I did. He barely knew me at that point. So this really exemplifies the enormous hospitality and generosity of Will and his wife, Anne, who both always took care of the many newcomers in the group, hosting and feeding and entertaining us or helping out whenever needed. When my car slid off my driveway into the snow ditch in my first months in Fairbanks, late one night, Will was there half an hour later, equipped with anything possibly needed to pull it out. And so he did. For years, Will popped up in my office in the morning with a big smile, but very surprised why I was in there. It used to be his office, and it was just a natural hardwired route for him to take before realizing his office was now somewhere else. I also fondly remember the many times I found a small vase with lady slippers or other beautiful flowers on my desk or in front of my door of my house. Will handpicked or maybe stole them in his neighborhood and loved to cheer us up our day by placing them on people's desk. The unspoken expectation was to return the vase so it could be filled again. Glaciology was, of course, one thing he was good at, but Will also excelled in German poetry. His command of the German language was excellent, much better than he ever admitted or realized. However, it really blew me away when he repeatedly, out of the blue, started reciting long passages of some 19th century German poetry, which included words that probably went extinct before I was born. He relished those moments, and we had a lot of fun discussing the poems, which he obviously understood, but I didn't. So I dearly miss Will, but I really feel privileged that he was in my life And I'm glad for all the good memories and the many ways that he together with my dear friend Anne, made my 14 years in Fairbanks a very special and unforgettable time. Thank you.
Thank you, Regina. And then we have Matt Nolan.
I wanted to share one of my favorite Will stories from the field, one that I think captures a lot of who he was and what he meant to me. This was, I want to say 95, maybe Martin would know. I think it was your first field season on Black Rapids. It was me, Martin, Dale, and Will drilling, I don't know, half a dozen holes to the hot water drilling holes to the bottom, 400, 500, 600 meters deep. So it was a big project for 4 people, and it was a lot of work to do, right? This is like early April, -20, -30. We get there, everyone starts to do their own thing. And I think it was at this point I really realized that Will's personal motivation behind being a glaciologist was just another excuse to work on old alpine snow machines. That may have been one of his primary motivations. So the first day we're out there, he goes, and this is an important plot point, he goes out, works on snow machine we had cached out there. Dale's putting together his hundreds of tons of stuff, and I'm setting up the cook tent and in the camp, and Martin's probably trying to figure out why he's out here or what he'd just gotten himself into. And the next morning, Will comes into the cook tent, and his right thumb is the size of a fucking lemon. I mean, it was the most gross thing you could imagine. This was not like pretend frostbite where you get a little nip. This was like full on severe, we're gonna have to amputate your thumb kind of frostbite, right? So the guy's hand's totally useless. He doesn't want to leave the field. I mean, as Tad said, totally unflappable, didn't complain. He's just looking at it like everyone else going, look at this. We call back on the HF radio, talk to a doctor. Doctor said you should come in. Will's like, well, I'll just stick it out. So for the next few days, he's trying to be useful because, he's Will. He's, there's a half a dozen easy, really funny and somewhat sad stories about him trying to be useful and actually not being. And eventually he realized much later than us that he was not only not helping us out there, he was actually getting in the way at times because without your right hand, your right thumb, it's hard to do anything. So Will being Will, he decides to cook for us. We've already heard some of the food stories. This is actually before the food even got cooked, is the story. We're in the tent. We have a table. It's like a 2-meter dome tent. We've got a table. Will and I are on one side. Martin and Dale are on the other. It's one of those Coleman double burner stoves, with a flap, that green thing that lifts up for a windshield, and the red can you put in for the gas. And Will was in there trying to get it going. And of course, he's trying to start a match, but his thumb is useless, right? So he's got these wooden matches and he's trying to work it and to break it in half. He's starting to get a little frustrated. Finally gets one lit. And then he drops it. And the stove, the table, and the floor just burst into flames. Everything. And of course, the other guys on the other side of the table don't really realize what's going on, right? Because they're blocked by that green thing. Each step, we're on snow, so every footprint is a little divot in the tent floor, and every one of them is just a ball of burning snow. Nobody got hurt. We eventually got it all put out. And as it turned out, that red can, it's got like a little twist filler cap you got to put. But without his thumb, he had trouble. He must have cross-threaded it or not gotten it tight. So he's trying to pump it to pressurize it. He's not using his thumb either, and he can't really see what he's doing. He had been spraying fuel all over everything, the table, the floor, himself, burst into flame. The part that gets me about all that is here's a guy, super useful, incredibly knowledgeable, with a thumb that looks like it should be amputated. I don't recall ever once hearing him complain, ever showing anything but grace, and as Tad and others said, just unflappable about it. Anyone else you would have had to send home because they would have been just so annoying or in pain or whatever it was, but not Will. He stuck with it every time and tried to make it work. And for that, he's a role model for me for grace that I've never even come close to reaching, but always aspired to have that unflappableness. It was really inspirational. And I'm shocked that nobody else has brought up this story. So I'm going to have to share it. I wasn't planning to. I don't know if it was on that trip or a different one, but we ran low on toilet paper. We're running low. And so Will shared with me in his unflappable, somewhat raunchy side of his sense of humor. I don't have any toilet paper, but I have a piece of paper towel here. So Will explained to me as we were running low on toilet paper, in his words, the Scottish method for wiping one's ass. You start with one square. This is useful for the future. I think this is a lesson that needs to be passed on. You start with a single square. This is a rectangle, but a single square of toilet paper. Fold it in half like so. Fold it in half again. Now, this is an important point. You have to take a little corner off of where it's all meeting. You take that little piece. You have to set it aside because it becomes important later. Now, I can't come close to reproducing Will's facial expressions of telling a story like that, but one inserts one's middle finger into the middle of that square, and then goes your business, and then carefully cleans your middle finger with a piece of paper towel, sets that aside, disposes it for later burning. Now we get back to that little square. This little piece that you took off is for cleaning the nail under the middle finger. And that's two of my fondest stories from Will that stuck with me. And again, I lost touch with him a little bit later in life, but I think of him often, and every time brings a smile to my face. And he was a great role model and mentor for me throughout my life. And I want to thank Martin and everyone else for organizing the event. It's been really great to hear all these stories.
Thank you, Matt. Yes, the introduction to the Scottish method was a bit of a culture shock for a new graduate student from Switzerland arriving here. And I well remember the black thumb at the evening after dinner ritual redressing. And I just could not believe that he would not leave the field and get this treated. Unbelievable. Yeah, that was a good story. I think the last of the speakers we have signed up is Bill Holman. Are you on? Bill?
I am.
There we go.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you, and now we can see something. There you go.
Okay. Well, I'm here. I didn't meet Will till about 20 years ago when I moved from Craig, Alaska to Fairbanks to be with Michelle Bartlett. And she was friends with both Will and Ann. And we did several things together, like camping out by Black Rapids and having dinners together and so on. But one of the things that I want to talk about goes right in with what I've been hearing about Will. And am I not on the picture? I guess I'm not, right? But can you hear me?
We can hear you, and we can see the upper half of your face, so you might have to
Oh,
tilt it a little.
How's that? Is that any better?
We'll see the lower half, so go in between. There you go.
Anyway, the thing of it
Yeah,
is
now you're
that
good.
great chair. So anyway, we had an opportunity to take a group down the Grand Canyon, and we were eating dinner over at Will and Ann's house and talked them into coming down the Grand Canyon. And this is a little different exercise than a helicopter craft. We made it all the way down to Lava Falls, and we got out and we scouted Lava Falls, and Will was with this supposedly the best boat person in the whole group. And we were, our raft and guide and people went out ahead, just ahead of them. And we managed to skirt around this rock that took most of the river and shot it up in the air. But I was turned around and looking at Will's raft coming down through there. And the raft went up in the air like a bird and landed upside down in the water in Lava Falls. And of course, all the occupants left that raft. But the next thing that I saw is Will and his mate, which was one of the women, pulled up on top of the raft, and we pulled up the other person that was in the raft into our raft and all made it over to shore. And Will got out of the raft, and people handed him dry clothes and whatnot. I handed him dry clothes. And he was as unflappable as anything else. And the two things I want to mention about Will is the night that we had dinner and talked him into going down the Grand Canyon, I looked at his eyes, and his eyes were not sparkling very much. You know, he was 2 weeks younger than I am. I'm 84, and he was just 2 weeks younger than I am. And I told him that this trip down the Grand Canyon would be really good for him because it would be an outside activity. And sure enough, the lights came back in his eyes, and he loved every minute of the Grand Canyon trip, including going over in lava falls and reaching the shore very safely. Always a laugh, always a smile, always a good morning, Bill. Anyway, I love that man and was very sorry to see him in the fix that he was in towards the end of his life. And anyway, thank you for letting me join with all of the university people. I am a graduate forester, but not a glaciologist, but I did run the National Avalanche School for the US Forest Service for several years when I was working in Washington, DC. So at least I knew a little bit about snow, albeit not glaciers. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Bill. And I think Anupma Prakash made it back on, and I think she was just going to address everybody. Is that right? Are you on, Anupma?
Yes, I am. Thank you. Thank you, Martin. Thank you for taking me on late in this meeting. But today I'm here to just share my thoughts about Will, not as a provost, but as his colleague when I was at the Geophysical Institute. Of course, there's so many people here who have stories about Will, and they speak about his impact at the university and at a personal level. For me, I worked with Will on a project called Ice Patch. It was a small project. It wasn't really a big project, but that's when I came to working with him. It used remote sensing imagery, airborne flights. Matt Nolan spoke about it. I see Chris Larson there. Martin Stufer probably is on the call. These people all collected this kind of data, and Will was absolutely fascinated by technology and this high resolution data because he'd seen the field, and once we would zoom in on the computer, he could see things that he knew about, and he would just get absolutely fascinated. I worked with an undergraduate student with him on this project. And when we were putting the project proposal together, I said, Will, how much time of mine do you think you would need? How much should I put in there? How many hours? And he said, you just never know. And I thought, what does he mean? And true to his words, what happened was we just got so fascinated in the whole project and just started talking and started having lunches together. And that lunch, during that phase, it became like an every second day affair, and the lunchtime would just go on to just conversations. And we spent hours and hours more just talking and being fascinated because he was so curious about the technology we were using and how we were mapping. And our team, the student and I was so curious to learn from Will the immense knowledge that he had about the field and about glaciology and about the climate and about warming and about these secret spots that we were not supposed to tell anybody because it was confidential. But that relationship was so beautiful. And what I always think back is that as you go in your career, in your life, and you think, what were those moments that really inspired you? It was those things that matter so much more than the number of projects we do and the work we do. It was his curiosity, his smile, his enthusiasm, and his inspirational characteristic that just stays with you forever. It's not one thing. It builds a culture that you just love, that you thrive on. And that's the kind of thing Will was a kind of mentor who just inspired you for a lifetime. And I'm so grateful that I had the opportunity to be a part of that circle that was directly influenced by Will. I always remember his smile and his just coming up over there and just talking. And those are thoughts that I take back with me. And just am very, very grateful for that. So yeah, just thankful to Will and what he started and what he contributed to many, many, and how he touched our lives.
Thank you so much, Anuma. And I just wanted to, before I pass it on to Matthew Sturm here, I just wanted to note that both Tom and Dan on the chat shared how much they appreciated people telling these stories. And I know Anne does as well. And I know I've heard from many of Will's relatives that they're probably not used to hearing him referred to as Will. I've just learned recently that in Canada he is Bill. And I've heard from many of them over the last 2 weeks or so here in response to this event, sharing stories, sharing pictures, and actually many of them not being aware of what a scientific impact Will had on so many of us, because he wouldn't, as I said earlier, he wasn't one to really point that out to everybody. So I'm going to pass it on to Matthew Sturm for some closing remarks. I think we've gone way, way longer than we scheduled, but I could not have brought myself to interrupt anybody here. I really enjoyed hearing this. And I think if others want to speak after Matthew, if some people want to stick around, I think that's okay. We can leave this call open. But I clearly understand that we're already more than a half an hour longer than we said we're going to be. But I do want to pass it on to Matthew Sturm before that. So, and before I do that, just so that I don't forget, I really want to thank the Geophysical Institute for the support, Bob McCoy, and very, very much Kelly Egan, who put so much effort into getting all the photos together and just keeping us all in line here today. So I hope we can all give our own private applause here to Kelly and thank her for that. So I'm going to pass it on to Matthew.
Okay. Can people hear me?
We can hear and see you, and you even dressed up.
Yeah, I thought Will would like that.
You would.
Yeah, because it's so out of character. Before I go anywhere else, I just want to finish Bill Holman's story, and then I want to close. So Betsy and I went down the Grand Canyon with the same tour group that Will went down the previous year. And indeed, we heard the story about the raft flipping, but Bill missed one thing that most of us who knew Will would have greatly appreciated. Upon getting the raft to shore, Will was soaked, and there were a lot of female raft guides, and they stripped his clothes off to get these new dry clothes on him. And the guides we had the same guides expressed to us that Will had the most amazing smile on his face during this procedure of getting him dry. Yeah, I thought people would probably like that. I came to UAF in 1981. Will served on my master's and my PhD committee. We worked together in Greenland on Fells, Variegated, and Black Rapids Glacier, all of which was pivotal growth experience for me. But I want to speak more directly. I can't remember the year, but Doug McHale, who's on the call, was the editor of the Journal of Glaciology, and periodically the journal needs a new editor, and that's usually a traumatic experience. Someone has to be the editor. Neither Will or I were doing field work could be the editor alone, so we decided we'd be co-chief editors. And for the next, I think, close to 10 years of my life, I was in his office once a week. And boy, that was one of the most wonderful and amazing things, a growth experience, a friendship experience. He was a mentor, friend, and inspiration. The stories were wonderful today, and I started jotting down adjectives that describe the man. Here's my list, and then I will try and bring it back together. Generous, unflappable, graceful, inventive, curious, clever, a history buff, scatological, an old goat, warm, funny, irreverent. My favorite, I wrote down frugal, and then I realized frugal barely describes what Will actually did about money. Parsimonious to the extreme would be my version. He sent Dan and I out with a gold line that was so old it was black and crusty. Adventurous, mechanical genius, humble, pithy, and my favorite, and the one I just want to go a little further on, was insightful. Over and over, we've heard today of his insight as a scientist and the seminal work he did. The nearly 10 years where we edited the journal, I saw another side of the man, which was equally insightful, but was insightful about human nature. The job of editing a journal, being the chief editor, is one of saying no or yes to people. And ego is involved, and feelings and everything. And so day by day, when we would deal with a paper, it wasn't just a matter of whether it was scientifically rigorous and correct or written well. It was also who's behind the paper and what would our actions do. And literally every day, Will and I would have a discussion. I would learn from him about this insight into how humans worked. He showed a sensitivity that amazed me at times. When I would have blundered and hurt feelings, Will would caution me. It was really marvelous. In addition, if I'm a good writer, it's because during those periods of time, I probably had the best chance to learn how to be a writer under Will's tutelage. I remember him saying to me one of the most useful things ever. It's not what you put in, it's what you decide to leave out that makes the piece. My last interaction with Will had to do with his love of history. Betsy and I got a chance to go to Scotland, and we went to Scapa Flow. For those who are history buffs for World War I and II, this is where the British put their fleet to bottle up the Germans. It's a large, which is the island? Anyway, it's in
the Orkneys.
The Orkney Islands, yeah, and a British fleet in there. So I'd found these history books of Scapa Flow, which I gave to Will because, like me, he was fascinated with ships. Early on, I think it was somebody called Will a Victorian, and I think that's half right. My view of Will is more complicated. He was some wonderful combination of Victorian and Renaissance, a complex man, a mentor, a friend, an inspiration to all of us. So I was thinking, how do I end this? And I realized my words probably are not strong and passionate enough. So I looked around for something I think Will would like, and I'm just going to read this. This is, for those of you who know the poem, it's called Sea Fever, and it celebrates ships. We love the tall ships. It's by John Masefield, Port Laureate of England. I must down to the seas again, to the lonely sea and sky, and all I ask is a tall ship and a star to steer her by, and the wheels kick and the wind's song and the white sails shaking, and a gray mist on the sea's face and a gray dawn breaking. I must down to the seas again, for the call of the running tide is a wild call and a clear call that cannot be denied. And all I ask is a windy day and the white clouds flying and the flung spray and the blown spume and the seagulls crying. I must down to the seas again, to the vagrant gypsy life, to the gull's way and the whale's way, where the wind's like a whetted knife, and all I ask is a merry yarn from a laughing fellow rover into quiet sleep and a sweet dream when the long trip's over. I think for all of us, there's a huge hole left in our lives now that Will is gone.
Yeah, thanks so much, Matthew. And I want to thank everybody for coming. I do understand we've been going much longer than we said. So if people have to sign off, thanks very much for coming. It was great to see and hear you all. As I said, I think we'll leave this call open and people can put in the chat if they want to keep sharing stories. I certainly would love to hear more. I know right now, I think Craig Lingle and John Davies and Mark Faunestock have all indicated that they'd like to say a few words. So maybe let's go in that order if we can. And yeah, thank you again, Matthew. So Craig, are you on now?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, triumph. I cut out for a while. Sorry about that. Yeah, but I actually am here. So I just wanted to mention that the first time I heard of Will Harrison was when I read an article he had written in the published in the 1968 American Alpine Journal about a first ascent he had made of a large, gigantic, dangerous ridge on Mount Rogan with legendary Alaska climber Vin Homan. And this was in 1967, for about 7 years prior to when I even started graduate school. And then once I went to the top, they met the rest of the expedition who had ferried supplies up the East Ridge and continued to the summit. And then made the first traverse of Mount Logan, which has 11 peaks over 5,000 meters high, eventually ending up on the Ogilvie Glacier. And but I strongly suspect that this experience on the incredibly large and heavily ice-covered peak, Mount Logan, in the most heavily ice-covered range of North America, the St. Elias Mountains, was what tipped Will toward his decision to abandon nuclear physics and pursue glaciological research. And 2 years after that, in 1969, tragically, Vin Homan was killed along with 6 of his other expedition members, attempted a new route on Dhaulagiri in the Himalaya. Unfortunately, Will did not accompany them on that expedition. He did, however, go on to a very long and illustrious career in glaciology, which we have heard much about. And just to mention briefly, I had to say there was an incident that illustrates one of Will's characteristics, which is his generosity, both not just in a personal sense, but in a financial sense when it came to helping new younger people in glaciology. When I was serving a year-long sentence at the National Science Foundation as the program manager for glaciology, I came to realize that in order to get 2 new young glaciologists into the program who were very promising but badly needed funding, I would have to ask everyone in the program to accept a 10% budget reduction. And in every case, it was like I was asking them to sacrifice their firstborn child, with only one exception. That exception was Will Harrison. He was the only one who immediately said, "Yes, I can do that." And well, I think that shows something about Will. So that's mainly what I wanted to say.
Yeah, thank you, Craig. Yeah, I only saw that climbing article just recently. I knew he'd done it, but that's quite an amazing article in the Alpine Journal there about that climb. Let's see. I know John Davis had indicated he wanted to say a few words. Are you on, John?
Yeah, I am. Thank you very much. Just a quick word. So many wonderful stories today. And I had a tangential career to Will's at the GI, you know, in seismology, and not, you know, and did some mountain climbing, not very much, but some. And so I knew Will through the Alpine Club here a little bit, and just through our connection at GI. But what amazes me, I was thinking about his friendship with Paul Perrault and Phyllis Perrault, who have both left us since. But I was pretty good friends with them when I was an early graduate student in the late 60s. And Will had this habit of staying in contact with people, you know, where, like, many stories about how he would be someplace and he just stopped by and visit for a little bit. Well, he did that with the Perraults through pretty much their whole life. And he would always come back and check in with me and let me know how they were doing. And that was sort of a marvelous thing. I thought you know, he had so many irons in the fire. He was doing so many different things, so much wonderful research, meeting with people, doing all these kinds of things, working on the journals. And yet he still maintained this connection with just an enormously wide range of friends. And I just marvel at that ability of his to maintain that level of humanity throughout a very productive and busy career. And so I'm just grateful for having met him and for his generosity, his spirit in that regard.
Yeah, thank you, John. And I think there was Mark Faunestock also.
Yeah, hi. I just wanted to, it really echo just a few things that we've heard over and over again. Primary among those is sort of the care and humanity that Anne and Will extended to colleagues and families. I know I and my family benefited tremendously over our time in Fairbanks, and Anne and Will have provided me with a home away from home now for a number of years. And then the other is sort of bookends to my understanding of the way Will thinks scientifically about things. I came into Caltech and glaciology just past post-variegated. So I didn't get to meet him there. But I think I first became aware of the way he thinks about things, the way he thought about things, and the way he would bring physics and sort of elegance to them when, for all those cameras and all the difficulty getting them to work, there was one more problem which wasn't mentioned, which was that the tripods would shift slowly over time, and that would mess up the data. And there's this incredibly elegant treatment of how to correct that problem in a paper. And it was sort of the beginnings of thinking through not just how to measure things, but what you do when they go wrong and how to do that in a coherent way, that it just got me started. And we've heard a lot about surges, and we all think about them. And if you were doing glaciology in the late 1980s, or you were enmeshed in all this, you know that there were all these attempts to explain what was going on and theories put forward. But in the the last decade, many conversations with Will, he was convinced we don't have the answer yet, and that the answer has to do with the debris that's under the glaciers. And he's going to be right. And when I think about conversations scientifically that I've had with Will, it always comes back to this great place to start on that problem again. And I just know that at some point in time, it's just going to become clear that most of this is just down in the dirt that he spent all this time working on, and we just haven't put a clean Will Harrison style wrapper around that problem. Thank you guys for all doing this. This has been really good.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. And again, great to see everybody here. I don't see any more.
Looks like there's a Cliff who would like to speak.
Sorry, I couldn't hear that well, Kelly.
I'm unmuting Cliff, who has his hand up.
Okay.
I think I was pushing the mute button while you were unmuting me.
Oh.
I just wanted to add one more thing regarding the academics and how much joy he got from it. The cameras would take pictures, and not only would they lean, but they would also, there was just spherical aberration. And one day we would already started digitizing the data, and we were seeing some of the results and getting pretty excited about it. And he calls me in. He rarely called me to his office, but he had something to show me. And he showed me his work paper that was, I couldn't tell what it was because it was a type of arithmetic I had never been exposed to before, but he had figured out how to correct the whole image in order to smooth the data back out. And he said, "Do you think you can code this?" And I said, "Well, I think so. I mean, I'll just translate it." And it worked. And he was just the look on his face when he had completed this matrix analysis puzzle was just wonderful. I mean, he was just so happy with himself that he had actually applied some mathematics from his history and to glaciology. It was great. It was just a wonderful thing. That's all for that story. Thank you very much for this whole situation.
Okay, well, if anybody else would like to speak up, please do so now. And otherwise, I don't know, Kelly, if you want to put the slides back on and just let people kind of walk out as they want to, or.
Yeah, I can put the slides back on, and I'll take off the function so people can unmute themselves if they like.
Okay. Well, great again to see everybody, and thank you for coming. And I'm sure we'll all remember these stories for a long, long time. And if you want to share this presentation with anybody, then please let us know. It has been recorded. So for people who couldn't make it and like to see it, we can share that. Okay.
Thanks,
Bye,
Martin.
everybody.
you play the video, but I'm going to stop the music really fast.
Actual verification of the estimated depth of McCall Glacier was attempted this summer through the use of an electrical heating element designed to melt its way to the glacial floor. Power to the heating element, or heat point, is supplied by a portable electric generator with variable power output. Logistically, the McCall Glacier project is no easy task. Any slight miscalculation, and the drops could land in the rugged terrain surrounding the glacial valley. Even if the remains were ever found, it would take considerable effort to recover them. All the drops were successful, thanks to the skill of the Alaska Air National Guard. The parachutes are packed, and along with the empty drums are returned to Fairbanks to be used again and to avoid any man-made debris on the glacier. The main camp serves both as a home and as a center for collecting and organizing scientific data. A good hot cup of coffee is always available. The lack of privacy in our one-room camp is forgotten in the spirit of excitement and cooperation we all have in the project.